Today we have Professor Marit Kragt. She's the director of the Center for Agricultural Economics and Development, and also a program lead in the Net Zero Agriculture CRC. And she has chosen to talk about strategies to reduce emission from Australian farms for her birthday. It's her birthday today.
Oh. I thought I'd do it today so I wouldn't forget. And I was just talking. Sorry, I'm going to be distracted every time that happens. Just apologizing in advance. So I talked to Herman about what topic I would present today, and you know the expression that the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know, and that's very much the situation I'm in right now. That I was thinking about a topic, and I was like, there's not any topics that I know enough about to give a seminar on, which is not true. I know, but doesn't feel that way. And one of the topics that I know plenty about is strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, because I've been working on that for the past 3 years, working on a large cooperative research centre for reducing emissions from Australian agriculture. So Herman said, why don't you talk about that? Because there's a lot of new knowledge in that space, and some of you may know plenty about emissions, but I tend to forget, working on emission reduction every day, that there's actually plenty of people who don't work on that every day who might actually learn enough about the topic if I discuss that at a seminar. So there we are. But before I talk about what can Australian agriculture do and why would we do it, can everybody see these slides, or do we need to turn the front light on? Yeah, give a bit of a global context. So I was in Canberra this week at a conference of Farmers for Climate Action, and Mark Howden gave a presentation that it's still quite upsetting to me now after 5 days. And one of the things he showed was he gave a bit of a global introduction about CO2 emissions and why we're actually talking about reducing emissions from Australian agriculture. And so I thought I'd start similarly about the exponential growth in CO2 emissions over the last 170 years, which is still rising every year, every day, which has a direct and unequivocally proven relationship with an increase in global emissions. So last year was the first, years ago, Paris Agreement, the world agreed that we would try and reduce emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Well, that didn't work, because last year was actually the first year that we broke the 1.5 degrees. And to a lot of people, 1.5 degrees perhaps doesn't sound like a lot, but that's the average degrees globally. So that includes oceans that have a cooling effect. It includes poles where perhaps areas in the world where the changes in temperature are not as stark. 1.5 degree above pre-industrial average is concerning, to say the least. And you can see how much that is going up. And the period from June 2023 to August 24, we had a record-breaking temperature every single month globally, which is very scary. Bringing that scary global picture back to Australia, I always think about, well, like I can't do anything about global things, but maybe I can bring it down to whatever I can do as an individual. And fortunately, there's a lot of things we can do. It's as Australians or as people living in Australia. So I'm not actually Australian, because Australia has a very high level of emissions. So whenever people I talk to say, well, why would we need to do anything? Because it's China and the US that have the biggest role in this global temperature increase. I think about our individual emissions as Australians, which are actually the highest in the world. So I think that's reason enough. Maybe as an individual that might not be the case, but on average in Australia, we are the highest emitters in the world, except for perhaps, I didn't map those here, like Kuwait, which is an oil exploiting country. Bringing it one step further down, Australia's emissions to the emissions by different sectors in the economy. This is a projection. So we have 2020. It started 2020. I took out the other years because the intermediate years to make it more visible. 2025 over here, and then there's projections of under current policies how we expect emissions to change, and this is the Q, so Department of Climate Change, Energy and Water, Federal Department modeling that they do every year, and that shows that we're in 2025 now. Agriculture's part of that emissions profile is not actually huge. 10, 14, 17%, I think it was. The numbers came out this week for 2025. But because emissions from other sectors are projected to decrease, especially electricity, the bottom one here, the share of agriculture's emissions is actually going to increase as a share of the total Australian emissions, projected to be about 32% in 15 years' time. So that would put a lot more attention on the agricultural sector, and on the agricultural sector to reduce, because the larger your profile, the more emphasis there will be on your on you as a cause of climate change. So that's why we're all coming together around the country, really, in the CRC for reducing emissions, but also this group of farmers for climate action, which has been around for 10 years. There's a group here in WA called ARE-UWA, also a group of farmers getting together to look at what can we do to make sure that we don't reach 32%, but also the food and agricultural industry across the country. Please ask me about that, because we don't have time to go into all the different groups that exist, and a coalition of the willing trying to do something about this. So getting to my topic is, how can we reduce these emissions? So the first thing to do is then look at, well, where do they come from? Emissions is a bit of an intangible concept for some people. So we look at, okay, what are the actual activities that cause these things? And the majority of agricultural emissions come from methane. And methane, it comes from livestock. And I'll have another slide that explains how that works for those who are not familiar. Other sources, so that's nearly 75, 77% of all agriculture's emissions in Australia come from methane. Other countries, it's different. I think New Zealand is it's a lot higher because they have a large dairy industry. Nitrous oxide emissions, also a very potent greenhouse gas. That's mostly emitted through fertilizer application and also a bit from manure. And then lastly, carbon dioxide, which is the gas that's mostly in the news when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually a very small component of agriculture. That's through mostly fossil fuel use. And comparative to the other things, it's only about 3 to 4%. So as a CRC, our primary focus is on that methane, nitrous oxide, and a little bit less on the carbon dioxide. And that's how I've structured my presentation as well, focusing first on methane and then on those other sources. I don't have a timer, so can you tell me when it's 10 past, 15 past?
Almost 10 past.
Okay, excellent. So where does methane come from? Some people think it's from the farts of animals, but it's not actually correct. Methane is a gas that's produced as livestock, so sheep or cattle, digest their food and then they burp that up. So methane is also a very potent greenhouse gas, about 28% larger heat holding capacity, if you want, compared to CO2, although you will hear other numbers going around and we can debate those at a later stage. So the understanding that it's a byproduct of digestion is relevant for the next slide, which talks about what can we actually do about that. I noted that manure also emits methane, but the majority of it comes from that digestive process. And what can you do? Because if you want to grow livestock, you kind of have to feed them. But there are still things we can do. And that's what the current research is looking at. But some of these things farmers can already adopt right now. For example, genetic selection. There's research underway, and there is breeders that advertise their bulls, for example, as being more efficient in feed conversion or in and reduced methane emissions. So which means that you grow faster. If the bull grows faster on the same amount of food, it means that the amount of methane emitted per kilogram of livestock weight is lower. That makes sense? So that's one area that we're looking into through breeding, but also through genetic profiling, for example. So that can reduce. Then there's a bit further into the future, looking at vaccines against methanogens that we can inject to reduce that methane intensity. I'm not an expert on that area, but there's some research in Australia on that. What people have probably heard more about is the feed additives, the asparagopsis or the seaweeds, that people heard about the seaweeds that you can feed cows. That can definitely reduce emissions because it changes the digestive process and the coating in the rumen. And that's been shown to be able to reduce methane emissions in situ by nearly 90%. So that's huge, which is great if you have the cow in a shed every day, like maybe in the Netherlands where I'm from. So you can feed them this asparagopsis every day. In Australia, where sheep and livestock is somewhere out in your paddock or somewhere out in your rangelands, it becomes a little bit more complicated. And at the moment, we haven't quite figured out how we're going to get that stuff to the livestock. There's also questions about, is it going to affect the taste? Is it going to affect the productivity? And that's all been shown to not be the case, but now we need to convince the consumers about that as well. But there's an avenue that is that has potential, except for the practical distribution for these more extensive systems. For the extensive systems, though, we can look at different pasture compositions. So there is native grasses, there's legumes that have an inherent lower methane profile when it's eaten by the livestock. So we can look at, just totally lost the name now, but there is legumes that can both increase the efficiency of the growth of that cattle and reduce the methane emissions. So there is people on campus here that look at growing those sort of legumes in our school. Negan Evans, Judith Lichtenstein, doing those sort of trials. And finally, we can change our practices, and that's something that farmers also can do right now. Changing for example, breeding cows earlier, which means that one cow gets more offspring, and therefore more feed is being produced, reduces methane emission intensity, and that's just a mathematical truth. So what's the time?
You have 7 minutes.
Fantastic.
Sorry, 6 minutes.
Fantastic, because I have only 3 more slides. I planned this. So that is the majority of the work that the CRC is doing, that a lot of research is going into, because we need to offset that 70, well, not offset, that was completely the wrong word. We need to reduce that 70% of methane emissions. And the things that farmers can do now is that selection and the early breeding and changing the feed, the vaccinations, the feed additives, that we're still working on the practicalities and evidence on those ones. But there's other things that growers can do to reduce those other sources of emissions, especially fertilizer. And a very obvious one is improving the efficiency of your fertilizer use so that you don't waste any. Waste is going to cost you money, but it's also going to emit nitrous oxides. So being more efficient through precision agriculture, through direct application, being how much you apply. There's a lot of research going into that area, and I think we're seeing great adoption, although we can always push that further. Direct application, for example, at seeding. But how much that saves depends on the system, so we don't have any percentages here. What we can also do is use a different type of fertilizer. Lots of research going into coating fertilizers, for example, or having fertilizers that are more and have what we call enhanced efficiency fertilizers. They could reduce emissions by up to 80% if that's adopted across the board. But of course, we are economists. They're more expensive, so we're not seeing that much uptake because they're more expensive. Unless we're going to either pay growers directly for their emission reduction or put a price on those emissions, we're not going to see uptake very much. So we're working on making those cheaper at this moment, and finding alternative ways to pay the farmers for uptake. Back to legumes again. Legumes can not only increase efficiency in the cattle that eats them and reduce the direct methane emissions by that cattle, it can also reduce nitrogen fertilizer needs, because legumes bind nitrogen in the soil. And then there's fewer options here for the cropping farmers. Improving lime use efficiency. So growers apply lime to depending on the pH of their soil, and that emits carbon dioxide, not actually nitrous oxide. So being more efficient in that, similar to the N fertilizer use. But this is I think 2 more slides, because I want to very briefly touch on that last source of emissions, CO2 emissions, which mainly come from electricity and diesel. Now, I said I've just been to a conference of farmers for climate action, and the majority of those 2 days was on this, wind farms and on renewables. And what do we do as a farming community this was mostly about negotiating with all these renewable energy developers that come into our rural regions and want to build either solar farms or wind farms. Now that's a fantastic solution to reduce emissions from our electricity grid, which, if you remember, was the lowest bar that's projected to go down. But that doesn't actually benefit any farmer because they can't access this energy directly. This goes into the grid, which I guess indirectly benefits the farmer, but doesn't reduce your emissions. So what we can do, and that already exists, is electric vehicles. There's lots of machinery that you can replace today from your motorbikes, and I can attest to how amazing electric motorbikes are, to electric tractors. They do exist, but they are more expensive. And there is then supporting infrastructure that needs to be built on the farm. But there is farmers out there in Australia. There's a cherry farmer in New Zealand, and you should look him up, who's electrified their whole business. But that requires traveling around the world, finding the tractor that fits your system, and in a West Australian context, where we have 30,000 hectares to harvest, the technology is not there yet because these electric tractors, can only pull 3.5 to 5 meters, which is insufficient for our cropping systems here in WA. But other things we can do, and that also exists out there, is just add solar panels to your system. And there is feedlots, for example, that have sheds covered in solar panels to automate the feeding of their cattle, which is an amazing solution if you're in remote regions. You don't have to go there all the time, and especially if you don't have grid access. Some really exciting avenues for electrification on farm. Before I start, wanted to preempt the what about the trees comments, because we do have those discussions a lot as well. Farmers could reduce their emissions by just planting more vegetation. That's not technically correct, because that doesn't reduce their emissions. It sequesters carbon from the atmosphere, and that is definitely true. Planting vegetation can sequester carbon from the atmosphere, which is unfortunately, which is what we need, given the high levels of CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. We're screwed if we don't plant more vegetation or store carbon in some other ways. But there's a limit to how much can be stored. The soil can only hold that much carbon. Vegetation can only hold that much carbon. There's only so much land that we can plant vegetation on. Plus, it doesn't technically reduce emissions. So this is my opinion, but looking at tree plantings, vegetation plantings, and soil carbon gives the big polluters in town an excuse to just continue emitting. I only have one slide on there, on that topic. So final is my presentation is about greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, mostly come from manure and fertilizers. And I've spoke about a bunch of things that we can do to reduce this. Some of them are already available, probably at a higher cost than current, but they are available. They are being tested. Others are still in different stages of development. So genetic selection, definitely we can already do. Vaccination, research underway. Feed supplement, research underway, but also being trialed. Selective pasture feeding, early breeding, and then I spoke about fertilizer, improving fertilizer efficiency, both in application, but also using more efficient fertilizers, and the integration of renewables. And this beautiful cow here has a contraption on their back that measures her methane being burped out. That's where I want to leave it. Herman's very strict.
Yeah, I give you an extra minute as a birthday present. First, are there any questions from PhD students? Maura?
Thank you for your presentation. But I just want to know, are so much like strategies that we can apply? Do you have any information about how farmers' attitude to these different strategies? Yes.
Yeah, I do lots. Yeah. I have a few more slides as saved away, but yes, that's definitely one of the areas of research that we are doing. How can we then? You can have all these beautiful technologies, but how do we get them adopted? And there's a cost component. That costs need to be low enough or need to be covered by something else, and that could be. It could be a subsidy, it could be the supply chain. Actually, I guess that's also a subsidy, but helping with those costs. There's a mindset change in that you're happy to drive electric vehicles, and anyone who has moved from a ICE car to an electric vehicle may have experienced that slight uncertainty of how is that going to work. Has anyone transferred to an electric vehicle here? Oh, that's very disappointing. But yeah, So it's just this uncertainty that you need to, so that requires lots of demonstrations that, yes, it does work. But there's also a whole broader system that we need to look at. So there's often the question, like, how do we get farmers to adopt? But there's also the broader support that we provide. Electricity is a great example, you know, is there the grid connection? Can we get farmers to actually access that electricity directly in their community? But also just the advisors. The advisors have enough knowledge about all those technologies, and the answer is no, right? Because advisors are not PhD graduates in a lot of cases. So there's lots of training going on around I only know about Australia, that helps both the farmers, expose them to all these solutions, but then also the advisors to be able to give the right advice.
Yeah, just curious. Okay, fine.
Talk to me.
We're going to go for break later. Yara, a short one, and then Anna online.
So looking at the presentation, the genetic selection and early breeding looks like low-hanging fruit. My worry is since they would definitely reduce the marginal cost, then there is an incentive for expanding the business because they're also going to be efficient for international trade. So they may also, if that business is expanded, then they can actually increase the emission. What are your thoughts on that part?
Yeah, absolutely true.
Great. Anna, online.
Oh, hi, everyone. Thanks, Marit, for your presentation. That was really insightful. I was wondering whether you or other people in the audience had any idea how these strategies to manage emissions on farm compare with changes to demand patterns, such as preferences and consumer choices.
Maybe someone in the audience, I have an opinion. But I always think we have 7 billion consumers, which is very hard, and segments of those might be able to influence what's being produced, but we only have, I wouldn't say a few thousand, but say tens of thousands of suppliers that's in Australia, which is a much smaller number of people that we need to influence. So that's just, that's one reason. And what I see in reality, I think I have just one very empty slide on that, is that actually most of the push doesn't come from consumers because it's just a small portion of people that have seen enough need to change their own behavior, because changing your own behavior is really hard. That most of the push actually comes from what we call the buyers in the supply chain. So for you guys, the Coles and the Woolworths and the McDonald's, who put products on the market, that's why I made this slide, who are being driven by international agreements to lower their emissions, both voluntarily, but also by some of the regulation that government's bringing in. So the Australian government last year brought in mandatory climate reporting, and I don't think people know enough about the shift that has generated. It only means that at this stage, large companies and banks as well have to report on their emissions. But of course, that's a bit of a stick to then start lowering those emissions. And that means that all those large companies that have to report are looking into ways to lower. And I just said banks. Banks are actually a major player there. NAB, Commonwealth, Rabobank have to find ways to reduce their corporate emissions. And what they're already doing in response to this mandatory reporting is, for example, offering discounted loans for people who want to adopt mitigation strategy. You just talked about how do farmers get this adopted. Well, one area is if I want to build a shed with solar panels, I can now access a loan at 1.5% discount, because the banks need to report on how they're reducing emissions. And these other two are international. SBTI is Science Based Targets Initiative, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They're all the big companies. You must have heard of, the vast majority of our consumer goods is owned by only 10 or 12 companies in the world. Well, those companies have to report. And when they commit is when we see action flowing, trickling down the supply chain.
Okay, thank you very much. I can say it. Yeah, Michael instructed me to say thank you, applause, and then I can say that we're going upstairs to get some snacks and things, and we're going to keep the conversation there, and we're going to celebrate Marit's birthday. Did you bring a cake?
If you don't mind,
Okay.
motorbike. But I did bring some.
We have some cake replacements.
Yes, I bought small things.
Okay.